Tracy gets to stay and hear me. But because we were studying Ruth, and today is chapter 2, where Ruth goes out in the fields and gathers the barley behind the workers, Tracy made a barley salad for the kids, and so now for us. And then there's a bunch. So tell me how it is. You can have some. You can have some already, and they're in the middle of service. All right. It might be a good, lesson, because, people learn different ways. Some people learn by hearing. Some people learn by seeing. Some people learn by doing. So maybe eating barley salad while you're hearing about gathering barley, maybe that'll help you learn the lesson today. I don't know. I'm just trying to cover all the bases here. Have you ever looked back on your life and realized that what seemed like an ordinary event was actually God guiding your steps? I read about a woman who found a lost wallet on a subway. She could have simply dropped it off at the subway office and moved on with her day, but she decided to go the extra mile and find the owner and deliver it personally. And this small act of kindness turned into this friendship that impacted both of their lives. And at the time, it looked like such a random event, but looking back, it became clear that something much bigger was taking place for those two ladies. Life is often like that. We see random moments, but God sees a larger story. We see these interruptions, but to God, they're opportunities. When we see a closed door, God is seeing a divine redirection. And many of us have experienced seasons where we wondered, God, where are you? We prayed, and yet the answers seemed delayed, and we worked hard, yet the progress seemed slow. We trusted God, but the future remained unclear. This is exactly where Ruth finds herself in chapter 2. She's a widow, she's poor, she's a foreigner living in a land that's not her own. She has no idea what tomorrow holds. Yet hidden in the ordinary events of one workday, God is arranging circumstances that completely change her future. In verse 3, it says, as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz. To Ruth, this was just an accident. She just went up to a field. But to God, this was providence. So here's the truth that we need today. What looks like coincidence is often the providence of God. Now, we can take this too far to think that everything is the providence of God. But just because you ran out of gas at the Circle K and they had a sale on Polar Pops, I don't think that's the providence of God because you like Polar Pops. That's just happened, you ran out of gas at Circle K. But there's other things I can think of my life that, I can see was definitely the providence of God. Even when we can't see what God is doing, He's still working behind the scenes. So today we're going to discover how God works through ordinary circumstances, faithful obedience to accomplish His purposes in our lives. And perhaps by the end of the message, some of us will realize that God is doing much more in our lives than we can presently see. So last week, we see that the Ruth is a book in the Bible that's all about responding to loss, to catch us up and to set the story for this week. Because of this woman, Naomi had left her home in Israel because there was a famine there. And we have a map, right? And so she was in Israel. She was in Bethlehem. She had to go to Moab on the other side, over around the Dead Sea there, and because they didn't have a famine there. So she was there. She took her husband and her 2 sons, and while she was there, her sons got married. Well, then they had a famine. No, the famine ended in Israel, so they decided to go home. But before they got there, her husband and her 2 sons died. And so now Naomi is left with her 2 daughters-in-law. And on the way, she said, you guys don't have to do this. You're not from Israel. You can stay. And so one of the daughters did, but Ruth said, I'm with you. Wherever you go, where I will go. Wherever you die, I will die. Whoever you worship, I will worship. And so she stayed with her. And so, but Naomi felt that God had dealt her a bad hand. And her name actually means pleasant, but by the time she got back to Israel, she said, don't call me that anymore. I'm bitter now. So that brings us to chapter 2. So we're going to ahead and open your Bibles if you have them with you. And I did this last week. This is how far Ruth is in the Bible. It's not very far. It's a small book. It's right after Judges. So we're going to start verse 1, and chapter 2, we're going to read all 23 verses. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, who is that woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. Now we remember from last week when they came back into town. It's a small town. Everybody knows everything in a small town. So we shouldn't be surprised that they know who Ruth is and what her relationship is. She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young woman working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly, and when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? I am only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. I hope I continue to please you, sir, she replied. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers. At mealtime, probably a spam call. I've been getting lots of spam calls. I hope I continue to please you, sir. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly, even though I am not one of your workers. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. Has anybody dipped bread in sour wine? I'm not brave enough to do that, sorry. Apparently it was something special, so I don't know. So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day. And when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain which was left over from the meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today was named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's field and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in the early summer. And all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. So that brings us to our first point. Step out in faith even when you do not have all the answers. Step out in faith even when you do not have all the answers. One of the most encouraging truths in this chapter is that God often guides people who are moving, not people who are standing still. When chapter 2 opens, Ruth and Naomi are in a very difficult situation. They're widows. They don't have any money. There's no social safety net waiting for them. They have no idea what's going to go on. But in verse 2, one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Now, this was actually a Jewish law outlined in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that says if you own a field, you have to allow poor people to come in and pick up what's left over. So when it was time to harvest the grain, you would have all your workers cut down the stalks and make big piles of them, and they'd come over and gather those piles. But anything that was dropped, the law said, leave it there so the poor can come pick it up. I guess that was kind of their social safety net then. It was really brilliant because it put some responsibility on the wealthy and also required the poor to work. So that act of picking up leftover grain was called gleaning. So Ruth, who just lost her husband, lost her homeland, doesn't know a single person except for her mother-in-law, wakes up and says, "Let me go find a field to glean in." Ruth did what she had to do to make an honest living for her and Naomi. She didn't know what was going to happen in the future, but she got started with what she could do. Now, a lot of us, we want to know what's going on. We want to know the whole map of our future before we start the journey. We want every question answered, because what if this, what if that, what if this other thing? We want all these risks mitigated. But God often says, just trust me with the next step. And, you know, we look in Scripture, and most people weren't given all the details. Abraham was told to go, but not where. Noah was told to build, but not when the rain would come. The disciples were told to follow, but not what every chapter of their lives would look like. So Ruth joins that list. She simply obeyed the next instruction in front of her. And there's another lesson here. She was willing to work. Faith did not make her passive. She trusted God. She also picked up her basket and went to the field. Sometimes people misunderstand faith. They think faith means waiting, just sitting still and waiting for God to do everything. But Ruth teaches us that faith and responsibility work together. She trusted God enough to act. A farmer can pray for a harvest, but he still has to plant the seeds. A student can pray for success, but they still got to study. A church can pray for revival, yet still shares the gospel with their friends and invites the community in. Ruth's obedience positioned her where God's providence would meet her. Notice that she did not find Boaz while sitting at home worrying. She found Boaz while faithfully doing what she could do. Sometimes God's blessing is waiting in the field of obedience. Sometimes the answer comes after the step of faith. So, what's the next step that God is asking you to take? Not eventually, but today. What do you think God is asking you to do today? Like Ruth, we may trust God enough to leave the house, or may we trust God enough to leave the house, enter the field, and take the next faithful step. Because God's greatest blessings begin with a simple step of obedience. And this brings us to point 2. Look up. God is arranging more than you can see. One of the most beautiful phrases in this chapter is in verse 3, as it happened. As it happened. At first glance, it sounds like a chance, an accident, maybe even luck. Yet when we read the whole story, we know it's not luck at all. Ruth thought she was just choosing a field, but God was directing her steps. She was just looking for some grain to feed her and Naomi, but God was preparing her future. She thought she was just trying to survive another day, but God was writing a redemption story that would impact generations. What appears to be coincidence from our perspective is often providence from God's perspective. The word providence refers to God's loving care and sovereign guidance over the events of life. So providence is God's loving care and sovereign guidance over the events of life. Remember that tapestry from last week? We look at this, and this is how we see the events in our life. And it's like, oh man, this is just random chaos, things just hanging out everywhere. But then we look at the other side, and this is what God had intended for us the whole time. This beautiful tapestry of our life. Ruth could not see chapter 3. She couldn't see chapter 4. She certainly did not see that one day her family line would lead to King David, and generations later to Jesus Christ himself. Yet God could, and because God could see the destination, he was directing every step along the way. And it strikes me how ordinary this chapter is. There's no angels, there's no fire from heaven, no seas got parted, or no miracles of any kind. But God just works through ordinary events. A field, a work day, a conversation, a kind employer, some extra grain laying on the ground. This is important because many believers expect God to work only through dramatic moments. And we want to think that God is going to dramatically rescue us from wherever situation we're in. And that I'm not going to put anything out of God's reach. That does happen from time to time. But more often, it's just the ordinary things. He works through relationships. Just like the new furniture that we got for our kids' rooms. That was through a relationship that Tracy and I had with our old church. They're remodeling their learning center, and they've got tons of this stuff, and it's like, yeah, now we've got this great furniture for our kids' rooms. Now we're ready for kids. That's amazing. He works through conversations, through opportunities, through open doors and closed doors. He works through people who choose kindness and through circumstances we barely even notice. And that kind of describes Ruth. She could see the field, but she could not see the future. So we have a picture of an iceberg here. So let's look at our iceberg picture, and we can see only a small portion is above the water, and like most icebergs, most of it is below the surface, and this kind of is like God's activity. We can see the visible parts, and we enjoy that, but God is working on the unseen parts. And notice how much more is being worked than what we can see. We see the meeting, but God sees the relationship that will develop from this person that we met. We see the disappointment, but God sees the protection hidden inside that disappointment. We see the delay in what we thought we're supposed to do, but God sees the preparation that is needed for us. Some of us can testify to this. Years later, we look back and say, like for me, for instance, if I had gone to the Air Force Academy like I thought I wanted to, I would have never met this beautiful woman over here. Some would say if that door had opened, I would have missed God's better plan. If that prayer had been answered exactly when I wanted it, I would have settled for less than what God's purpose was for me. At the time, it feels painful, but looking back, we can see God's fingerprints all over our lives. Perhaps someone here is in a time where God's plan seems unclear. Maybe you've got a health challenge, a family burden, maybe you've got financial pressure, or there's a broken relationship that's really weighing you down, or there's an important decision about your future that you've got to make. And maybe you feel like nothing is happening. I'm just sitting here waiting, and I can't feel anything. But this chapter in Ruth reminds us that God is often doing his deepest work when we can't see it. Just because God seems silent doesn't mean he's absent. Just because you cannot trace his hand does not mean you cannot trust his heart. The same God who guided Ruth through a field is guiding his children today. Isn't that amazing? How many thousands of years ago Ruth was in that field, and that same God is guiding us just like he was guiding her. That's so encouraging for me today. The same God who arranged her steps is arranging out yours. You look up. Do not focus on what is visible. Trust the God who is working in ways you can't see yet. Because while you are living today's chapter, God is preparing tomorrow's blessing. So what seemed like a coincidence is actually God's providence. God often works through ordinary circumstances long before we recognize his hand in what's going on. So that brings us to our third point. Trust God's favor in the middle of ordinary life. And favor can be described as divine kindness or provision. Divine kindness or provision. So God's providing for us. As we move deeper into this chapter, something remarkable happens. Boaz notices Ruth. And not like a how you doing kind of way. Although that's coming, but that's not initially how he notices her. Now, Ruth is nobody to be noticed. She's not a person of influence. She's not from that town. She's a Moabite widow gathering leftover grain behind the harvesters, which automatically everyone knows what her social status is, what her position is. And we overlook people like this all the time, don't we? Just right across the street, we could probably throw a rock and hit the intersection where we see panhandlers every day out there working the intersection. And you never know if they're professional panhandlers or are they really down on their luck. And so that kind of keeps a lot of us from doing anything. But, in this circumstance, in this story, she was not a professional gleaner. She actually, had this going on. But but Boaz saw her, and more importantly, God saw her. This is good news for anyone who has ever felt forgotten. And we probably all have felt forgotten at some point in our life. Maybe at work, you didn't get the raise you were looking for, you didn't get the project you wanted to do, or, excuse me. Or maybe you feel like the black sheep of this family, you didn't get noticed. Didn't get recognized for what, you've been doing this forever, for years and years, and you're not getting recognized, you're just getting taken for granted. But Ruth reminds us that even when people fail to notice us, God never loses sight of his children. So we have a picture here. This is a painting of this meeting of Ruth and Boaz. And I think this was in the 18th century when this was painted. I'm having a lot of fun finding these old paintings and showing them to you. So I thought that's pretty good. She's got her barley there. Verse 8, stay right here with us while you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. He offers protection. Boaz offers Ruth protection. He provides water. He invites her to eat. He instructs his workers to leave extra grain behind for her. He goes far beyond what the law is requiring him to do. He shows extraordinary kindness. And Ruth is overwhelmed. She says, what have I done to deserve such kindness? But this question reveals something really beautiful. She knows she has not earned this kindness, this favor, and she recognizes it as a gift. And this is where the story begins to reflect the grace of God. The grace is God's unearned favor, provision, or kindness toward us. The story of Ruth is not ultimately about a good woman finding a good man. It's about a gracious God pursuing people who could never save themselves. Throughout Scripture, grace always arrives before we deserve it. Before Ruth knew God's plan, God was already working. Before Ruth understood his purposes, he was already providing. Before Ruth could see their future, God was already preparing it. And this is one of the reasons that this story resonates so well with our Nazarene theology of prevenient grace, the grace that goes before us. God is already at work before we recognize him. Long before Ruth arrived, God had prepared Boaz's field for her. The provision was waiting before the need arrived. Isn't that kind of struck me this week as I was studying this. The provision was waiting before the need had even arrived. That's how much our God thinks of us, how much he cares for us. The opportunity existed before Ruth even knew she needed it. And that's how God works. I have a picture here to go along with my next illustration of parents preparing Christmas gifts weeks or months before Christmas morning. And so this is my picture of my grandpa. I think it's somewhere in the 50s, the night before Christmas, putting all these things together for my mom and my uncle. And now the kids don't know anything what's going on. Now, I have a friend that we grew up going to church together, and in a couple of weeks, she will start posting on Facebook, 147 weeks to Christmas, or whatever it is. You know, she starts in the middle of the summer, how many weeks to Christmas? And she just loves Christmas. And so, I don't know, maybe you guys are like that. You see something and you buy, oh, I'll save this for Christmas. I'm more of a week before Christmas online shopper sometimes. But there's some things I know how to do good. But the kid, they don't know anything that's going on because parents have this secret closet where all these presents get stored up. And when the day arrives, the child discovers what has been prepared all along, right? In a much greater way, God is often preparing blessings we cannot yet see. While we worry, he works. While we wait, he prepares. While we question, he remains faithful. Notice that God's favor came through ordinary means. Ruth still worked. She still gathered grain. She still sweated under the hot sun. Yet God's favor, provision, met her in the middle of her labor. Sometimes people imagine favor means a life without difficulty. And that is a danger because we see there are TV preachers and some that want to tell you that. And that's not what we're reading here, is it? That's not what we're reading. So we have to be careful not to get swayed by this pie in the sky God that's just going to dump $1 million in your lap and take you off, and so you never have to worry or work ever in your life. Ruth's story teaches us otherwise. Favor did not remove her hardship. It sustained her through it. God's grace did not eliminate every struggle immediately. Often his grace strengthens us during the struggle, doesn't it? The Apostle Paul learned this when the Lord said in 2 Corinthians, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. I wish it wasn't works best in weakness, you know. Let me have some when I'm doing good. Let me have some, some grace then too. But that's what Paul told us. This is the truth. Many believers spend so much time looking for those dramatic miracles that they miss these daily evidence of God's grace. Maybe it's a friend who encouraged us, a church family that supported us, strength for another day, peace in a difficult season, an unexpected opportunity maybe, a timely word from Scripture, maybe a door that God opened or maybe a door that God closed. All of these may be expressions of God's grace. And by the end of the chapter, Naomi finally realizes that God hadn't abandoned her, and so she doesn't have to be bitter Naomi anymore. Naomi had begun the chapter feeling empty, and now she begins to see hope again. One act of grace was becoming part of this larger redemption story. Maybe today feels like somebody feels like Naomi. Maybe you're just over it. You're just not getting what what's going on with God. Maybe you're feeling bitter, discouraged, or disappointed. But the message of this chapter is God has not forgotten you. He still sees you. He still provides. He still is working behind the scenes. It's not always flashy, but God is always faithful. And just as Ruth discovered, sometimes the very place where you think you're merely surviving becomes the place where God begins transforming your future. So trust His grace, trust His timing, trust His goodness, even when life seems ordinary. Because of God's favor, His approval of us often shows up in ordinary moments in life and turns into extraordinary testimonies. God sees those others overlook. His grace reaches us before we deserve it. His favor often works through ordinary circumstances, and His grace sustains us while His plans unfold. As we come to the end of this chapter, let's remember something important. Ruth still doesn't know the story. She's got this chapter that is unfolding, but she didn't know the whole story. She doesn't know that Boaz will become her kinsman redeemer. She doesn't know that she will become part of the family line of King David. She doesn't know that generations later her story will be connected to the birth of Jesus Christ. What she knows is God provided for today, and for Ruth, that was enough. We like for God to show us everything that's going to happen. But God usually gives us what He gave Ruth. Enough grace for today, enough strength for today, enough provision for today, and enough light to see the next step. So Ruth teaches these three powerful lessons. When you do not have all the answers, step out in faith. When life seems confusing, look up and trust God's providence. When you feel forgotten, rest in God's grace and favor. The same God who guided Ruth is guiding you. The same God who provided for Ruth is still providing for you today. He's still working behind the scenes, just like He did in Bethlehem all those years ago. Let's pray. Heavenly Father,